What happens when patience becomes the deadliest weapon? When 8 years of silent observation transforms into the perfect plan for justice? This is the story of how one woman's calculated revenge brought down an entire empire. One cup of coffee at a time. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. The morning mist clung to the sprawling plantation like a shroud, concealing the horrors that unfolded daily within the grand estate of Whitmore Manor. Built in 1847 in the heart of Georgia, this opulent mansion stood as a monument to wealth built on human suffering. Its white columns gleamed in the dawn light, a stark contrast to the darkness that festered within its walls. In the vast kitchen that served as the heart of this empire, a woman moved with practiced silence. Her name was Celia, though the masters rarely bothered to use it. To them, she was simply the cook, invisible, disposable, existing only to serve their endless appetites. But behind her downcast eyes burned an intelligence that none of them suspected, and a memory that recorded every cruelty, every injustice, every moment of their casual brutality. Celia had arrived at Whitmore Manor 8 years ago, purchased at auction like a piece of furniture. She was 22 then, torn from her family and thrust into a world where her humanity was denied with every breath. The kitchen became her prison, but also her sanctuary, the one place where she could think, plan, and slowly, methodically, prepare for the day when justice would finally be served. The journey to this moment had been marked by countless small humiliations and devastating losses. She remembered her first week at the manor, when she had accidentally spilled a drop of coffee on Margaret Whitmore's dress. The punishment had been swift and brutal, 20 lashes in front of the other servants, followed by 3 days without food. It was then that Celia realized she was not dealing with mere cruelty, but with a systematic dehumanization that required an equally systematic response. The Whitmore family ruled their domain with iron fists wrapped in silk gloves. Patriarch Jeremiah Whitmore, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his greed, had built his fortune on the backs of over 200 enslaved souls. His wife, Margaret, was no better, a woman who took perverse pleasure in devising new punishments for the slightest infractions. Their 3 sons, Thomas, William, and Charles, had inherited their parents' capacity for evil, each finding their own ways to torment those under their control. Thomas, the eldest at 35, was perhaps the most calculating of the sons. He had a particular talent for psychological torture, often promising rewards or freedoms that he had no intention of delivering. Celia had watched him break the spirit of strong men with nothing more than false hope and carefully timed disappointments. His cruelty was refined, almost artistic in its precision. William, 2 years younger, managed the plantation's finances with an obsessive attention to detail that extended to the lives of the enslaved workers. He kept meticulous records of every aspect of their existence, their productivity, their health, their family relationships, all in service of maximizing their economic value. To William, human beings were nothing more than entries in a ledger, assets to be optimized and exploited. Charles, the youngest at 28, was perhaps the most volatile of the family. His cruelty was impulsive and violent, erupting without warning over the smallest perceived slights. Celia had seen him beat a man nearly to death for looking at him the wrong way, then laugh about it over dinner as if it were an amusing anecdote. But the family's cruelty extended beyond the immediate household. Jeremiah's brothers, Samuel and Benjamin, along with their business partners, the Morrison brothers, James and Robert, formed a network of plantation owners who competed to see who could extract the most profit from human misery. Regular dinner parties at Whitmore Manor brought together this cabal of monsters, where they would toast their success while their victims served them in silence. These gatherings were particularly painful for Celia to endure. She would listen to them discuss new methods of discipline, share stories of successful breeding programs, and calculate the monetary value of human lives with the same casual interest they might show in discussing livestock. It was during one of these dinners that she first conceived her plan for revenge. As Celia prepared the morning coffee on that fateful day in 1855, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 8 years of watching, learning, and planning. 8 years of perfecting her craft not just as a cook, but as an architect of justice. The time had finally come to begin her masterwork. The kitchen was her laboratory, and she had spent years studying every aspect of her craft. She knew which spices could mask bitter tastes, which preparations could disguise unusual textures, and most importantly, she had discovered the perfect weapon hidden in plain sight: gold. It had started as an accident, really. While cleaning Jeremiah's study, she had noticed how he obsessively polished his gold coins, how he would scrape small flakes into his brandy as a display of wealth. She had researched in secret, using the limited access to books in the manor's library during her rare moments alone. Gold, she learned, could be toxic in certain forms and quantities. More importantly, it was the perfect metaphor for her revenge, using the very symbol of their greed to destroy them. The process of obtaining and preparing the gold had taken months of careful work. She had learned to collect the tiny flakes that Jeremiah scraped from his coins, gathering them grain by grain until she had accumulated enough to begin her campaign. Using a mortar and pestle hidden in the depths of the kitchen's storage areas, she had ground the flakes into an almost imperceptible powder that could be easily dissolved in hot liquids. The morning routine began as it always did. Celia ground the coffee beans with mechanical precision, her movements betraying nothing of the storm brewing within her mind. The rich aroma filled the kitchen, masking the metallic scent of the fine gold powder she had prepared over months of careful collection and grinding. Jeremiah was always the first to demand his coffee, his booming voice echoing through the manor as he called for his morning stimulant. Celia poured the dark liquid into his favorite china cup, the one with the family crest emblazoned in gold leaf. How fitting, she thought. With practiced steadiness, she added a barely perceptible amount of her special ingredient, stirring it in with the cream and sugar until it disappeared completely. "About time," Jeremiah growled as she entered his study, not bothering to look up from his ledgers. "I have important business today. The Morrison brothers are coming to discuss expanding our operations." Celia set the cup down with a slight bow, her face a mask of subservience. "Yes, Master Whitmore. Will you be requiring anything else?" "Just make sure dinner is perfect tonight. We're celebrating a new acquisition. 300 acres and 50 new workers. This family's empire continues to grow." As she left the room, Celia allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Indeed, things were about to change dramatically for the Whitmore empire, though not in the way Jeremiah expected. The day proceeded normally, with Celia going about her duties while carefully observing Jeremiah's condition. The effects would be subtle at first, perhaps some stomach discomfort, a slight headache. Nothing that would immediately raise suspicion. The beauty of her plan lay in its patience. This was not about quick revenge, but about systematic justice. That evening, as the Morrison brothers arrived for dinner, Celia watched from the kitchen doorway as the men gathered in the dining room. James Morrison, a thin man with cruel eyes, was regaling the group with stories of his latest disciplinary measures. His brother Robert, equally vicious but more calculating, was discussing new methods of increasing productivity through fear. "The key," Robert was saying as Celia served the soup course, "is to make examples. One public punishment prevents a dozen private rebellions." The men laughed, their voices carrying the casual cruelty of those who had never known consequence for their actions. Celia moved among them like a ghost, invisible in their arrogance, serving their meal while mentally cataloguing each face, each voice, each crime against humanity. As the evening wore on, she noticed Jeremiah rubbing his temples occasionally, a slight grimace crossing his features. The first dose was working, introducing the toxin slowly into his system. It would take time, weeks, perhaps months, but the process had begun. After the guests departed and the family retired, Celia remained in the kitchen, cleaning and preparing for the next day. But her mind was elsewhere, reviewing her plan and adjusting her timeline. 10 men had been in that dining room tonight, the core of the local plantation aristocracy. 10 men whose combined cruelty had destroyed countless lives. She pulled out a small, leather-bound journal hidden beneath loose floorboards, her record of their crimes, their schedules, their habits. Each page detailed a different target, their preferred drinks, their routines, their weaknesses. This was her Bible of justice, 8 years in the making. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Gold poisoning was slow and subtle, its symptoms easily mistaken for other ailments. More importantly, it was poetic, using the very substance they worshipped to destroy them. Each man would receive carefully calculated doses, administered through their beloved coffee, their evening brandy, their celebratory champagne. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, Celia finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had begun. There was no turning back now. The first move had been made in a game that would span months, perhaps years, but she had time, patience, and most importantly, she had justice on her side. The next morning brought news that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but to Celia, it was confirmation that her plan was working. Jeremiah complained of a poor night's sleep, of strange dreams and an unsettled stomach. Margaret fussed over him, calling for the doctor, but the physician found nothing obviously wrong. "Perhaps it's the stress of business," the doctor suggested. "These are challenging times for men of commerce." Celia served the morning coffee with the same practiced efficiency, adding her special ingredient with the skill of a master chemist. Day by day, dose by dose, she was dismantling the foundation of their empire from within. 3 months had passed since Celia began her campaign of justice, and the effects were becoming more noticeable. Jeremiah Whitmore, once a robust man who commanded his domain with thunderous authority, now moved with the careful steps of someone fighting constant fatigue. His appetite had diminished, his temper had grown shorter, and most tellingly, his grip on the day-to-day operations of the plantation had begun to slip. The beauty of Celia's method lay not just in its subtlety, but in its psychological impact. As Jeremiah's health declined, paranoia crept into his mind. He began to suspect his business partners of trying to undermine him, his sons of plotting against him, even his wife of harboring secret resentments. The very bonds that held his empire together were fraying as the poison worked its way through his system. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The man who had once strode through the plantation like a conquering general now shuffled from room to room, pausing frequently to catch his breath. His voice, which had once boomed commands across the fields, had become hoarse and uncertain. Most significantly, his legendary attention to detail, the quality that had made him such an effective overseer of human misery, was deteriorating rapidly. Celia had expanded her operations with careful precision. Thomas Whitmore, the eldest son and heir apparent, had always been fond of his evening brandy. It was a simple matter to ensure his decanter was regularly cleaned and refilled, each time with her special addition. William, the middle son, preferred his coffee strong and black in the mornings, a habit that made Celia's work almost effortless. Charles, the youngest, had a weakness for the expensive champagne his father imported from France, never suspecting that each celebration brought him closer to his doom. The process of targeting each family member required different strategies and timing. Thomas's evening ritual was predictable. He would retire to the library after dinner, pour himself a generous glass of brandy, and spend hours reviewing business documents. Celia had learned to time her cleaning of his decanter to coincide with his afternoon rides around the plantation, ensuring that the poisoned brandy would be properly mixed and settled by evening. William presented a different challenge. His morning coffee routine was sacred to him, but he was particular about the preparation. He insisted on grinding his own beans and measuring the water temperature precisely. Celia had to find ways to introduce her poison into the coffee service itself, the cream, the sugar, even the cup, rotating her methods to avoid detection while maintaining consistent dosing. The Morrison brothers presented a different challenge as they didn't live at the manor, but their regular business dinners provided ample opportunity. James Morrison had a particular fondness for the manor's famous coffee service, often requesting multiple cups during lengthy negotiations. Robert Morrison, more cautious by nature, still couldn't resist the fine wines that accompanied their meals, each glass carefully prepared by Celia's steady hands. The dinner parties became elaborate exercises in precision poisoning. Celia would spend days planning the menu, not just for culinary excellence, but to ensure that each target received their carefully calculated dose. She developed a mental map of the dining room, knowing exactly where each man would sit, which glass he would use, which dishes he would favor. Margaret Whitmore had proven to be the most difficult target. As the lady of the house, she was suspicious by nature, and had a habit of changing her preferences without warning. But Celia had observed that Margaret never missed her afternoon tea, a ritual she considered essential to maintaining her social status. The delicate china service, the imported leaves, the careful ceremony, all provided perfect cover for Celia's additions. The afternoon tea ritual became a daily test of Celia's nerves and skill. Margaret was particular about every aspect of the service: the temperature of the water, the steeping time of the tea, the arrangement of the accompaniments. Any deviation from her expectations would result in harsh punishment for the entire kitchen staff. Celia had to perfect her technique to the point where the poisoned tea was indistinguishable from Margaret's usual blend. The other members of their circle, plantation owners Samuel and Benjamin Whitmore, along with their associates, attended regular gatherings at the manor. These men, who had built their fortunes on human suffering, never suspected that their host's declining health might be connected to their own growing list of ailments. By winter of 1855, the pattern was becoming clear to anyone who cared to look. But the beauty of Celia's plan was that no one was looking. In a world where the lives of enslaved people were considered worthless, who would suspect that one of them was capable of such sophisticated revenge? The symptoms manifested differently in each victim, adding to the confusion. Jeremiah suffered from severe digestive issues and chronic fatigue. Thomas developed persistent headaches and mood swings that made him increasingly unpredictable. William began experiencing memory problems that affected his ability to manage the plantation's finances. Charles, the youngest and strongest, showed the least obvious symptoms, but Celia was patient. His time would come. The progression of symptoms followed a pattern that Celia had carefully researched and planned. The initial phase involved mild digestive discomfort and fatigue, symptoms that could easily be attributed to stress or minor illness. As the poison accumulated in their systems, neurological symptoms would begin to appear: headaches, memory problems, mood changes. The final phase would bring severe organ damage and eventual death. The Morrison brothers, receiving smaller but regular doses during their visits, began to show signs of the slow poisoning. James developed a persistent cough that no doctor could explain, while Robert suffered from joint pain that made him increasingly irritable and difficult to work with. James's cough was particularly satisfying for Celia to observe. The man who had once boasted about making his workers sing while they labored in the fields now struggled to speak above a whisper. His breathing became increasingly labored, and he would often excuse himself from conversations to step outside for fresh air. Margaret's symptoms were perhaps the most dramatic. The afternoon tea ritual that had been her pride became a source of mounting anxiety as she began experiencing severe mood swings and periods of confusion. She would fly into rages over minor infractions, then collapse into tears without apparent cause. The transformation of Margaret was particularly striking because it affected her role as the social leader of the plantation community. Her famous tea parties became exercises in chaos, as she would forget guests' names, serve inappropriate refreshments, or launch into incomprehensible tirades about imagined conspiracies. The woman who had once terrorized the household staff with her arbitrary cruelty was becoming a figure of pity and confusion. As winter deepened, Celia noticed changes in the household dynamics that went beyond the physical symptoms. The family members, once united in their cruelty, began turning on each other. Jeremiah accused Thomas of incompetence when business deals fell through due to his declining mental acuity. Thomas blamed William for financial irregularities that were actually the result of William's increasing inability to focus on complex calculations. William and Charles fought constantly over trivial matters, their judgment clouded by the toxins slowly accumulating in their systems. The breakdown of family unity was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Celia's campaign. These people, who had built their power on the systematic destruction of other families, were now experiencing the dissolution of their own bonds. The paranoia and suspicion that the poison induced made them see enemies where once they had seen allies. The plantation's operations began to suffer as well. Overseers, taking advantage of their master's declining attention, became increasingly brutal in their treatment of the enslaved workers. But they also became careless, and several attempted escapes succeeded when they might have failed under normal circumstances. Celia used these disruptions to her advantage, carefully documenting everything in her hidden journal. She recorded not just the physical symptoms of her targets, but the broader impact of their decline on the entire system of oppression they had built. Each entry was a small victory, a step closer to the complete dismantling of their empire. The Christmas season of 1855 brought an opportunity that Celia had been planning for months. The Whitmores traditionally hosted a grand celebration, inviting all their business associates and social peers. It would be the largest gathering of her targets in one place, and she intended to make the most of it. The preparation for the Christmas feast required weeks of planning. Celia worked tirelessly, not just to create the elaborate meals expected by the family, but to ensure that each dish served to her targets contained precisely the right amount of her special ingredient. The Christmas punch, the coffee service, the fine wines, all became vehicles for her justice. The logistics of the Christmas dinner were staggering. 30 guests would be seated at the main table, with additional seating in the adjacent parlor for wives and younger family members. Each course required careful coordination to ensure that the right dishes reached the right people. Celia had to memorize not just the seating arrangements, but the dietary preferences and consumption habits of each target. The evening of the celebration, Celia watched from the kitchen as nearly 30 guests filled the manor's grand dining room. Among them were all 10 of her primary targets, along with their wives and several other plantation owners who had not yet earned a place on her list. The irony was not lost on her. They were celebrating the season of peace and goodwill while surrounded by the evidence of their own cruelty. As the evening progressed, Celia moved through the gathering like an angel of death, serving course after course with perfect efficiency. She watched as Jeremiah, now noticeably thinner and more frail than he had been 6 months earlier, struggled to maintain his role as host. His hands shook slightly as he raised his wineglass for toasts, and his voice lacked its former commanding presence. Thomas, seated at his father's right hand, appeared distracted and irritable. He snapped at servants for minor infractions and seemed unable to follow the flow of conversation around the table. William, managing the wine service, made several obvious errors that would have been unthinkable for him just a year earlier. Charles, the youngest, seemed the most normal of the family, but Celia noticed the slight tremor in his hands and the way he rubbed his temples when he thought no one was looking. The Morrison brothers, seated as honored guests, both showed clear signs of their declining health. James's persistent cough interrupted conversations throughout the evening, while Robert moved stiffly, clearly in pain from his mysterious joint ailments. Margaret, playing the perfect hostess despite her own struggles, managed to maintain her composure through most of the evening. But Celia noticed the moments when her smile faltered, when confusion flickered across her features, when she seemed to lose track of conversations mid-sentence. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Celia overheard fragments of conversations that filled her with grim satisfaction. Several guests commented on Jeremiah's apparent ill health, speculating about possible causes. Others noted the family's increasing dysfunction, wondering if the stress of managing such a large operation was taking its toll. "Perhaps it's time for Jeremiah to consider stepping back," she heard one guest suggest to another. "The man looks like he's aged 10 years in the past few months." "The whole family seems off," came the reply. "Something's not right in this house." If only they knew, Celia thought as she began the long process of cleaning up after the celebration. Something was indeed not right in this house. Justice was finally being served, one carefully measured dose at a time. As 1856 dawned, Celia reflected on the progress of her campaign. 6 months of patient work had yielded remarkable results. Her targets were all showing clear signs of decline. Their empire was beginning to crack under the strain of their compromised leadership, and most importantly, no one suspected the true cause of their troubles. But this was only the beginning. Celia had planned for a long campaign, one that would systematically dismantle not just the individuals who had caused so much suffering, but the entire system they represented. The next phase of her plan would require even greater patience and precision, but she was ready. The cook who had once been invisible was becoming the architect of their destruction, and they would never see it coming. The spring of 1856 brought with it a series of events that would have seemed like mere misfortune to outside observers, but to Celia, they represented the inevitable consequences of her methodical campaign. The Whitmore empire, built on a foundation of human suffering, was beginning to collapse from within as its leaders succumbed to the slow poison that had been administered with such careful precision. Jeremiah Whitmore was the first to fall completely. What had begun as minor digestive issues and fatigue had progressed to severe neurological symptoms. His once sharp mind, capable of managing complex business dealings and maintaining iron control over hundreds of enslaved people, now struggled with basic conversations. He would forget names of long-time associates, lose track of important documents, and fly into rages over imagined slights. The deterioration was systematic and relentless. Jeremiah's famous memory for detail, which had made him such an effective manager of human property, began to fail in spectacular ways. He would call for slaves who had died years earlier, demand reports on crops that had already been harvested, and become confused about basic aspects of plantation operations that he had once managed effortlessly. His physical decline was equally dramatic. The robust man who had once ridden his horse across the plantation for hours each day now struggled to walk from his bedroom to his study. His hands, which had once signed contracts worth thousands of dollars without trembling, now shook so badly that he could barely hold a pen. The family physician, Dr. Harrison, was baffled by Jeremiah's condition. "I've never seen anything quite like it," he confided to Margaret during one of his increasingly frequent visits. The symptoms suggest several different ailments, but none of the treatments seemed to have any lasting effect. What Dr. Harrison didn't know was that he was witnessing the effects of chronic gold poisoning, a condition so rare that few physicians of the era would have recognized it. The gold particles that Celia had been carefully administering over months had accumulated in Jeremiah's organs, particularly his brain and nervous system, causing irreversible damage. The medical consultations became a source of dark satisfaction for Celia. She would serve tea to Dr. Harrison during his visits, listening as he puzzled over symptoms that she understood perfectly. The irony that the family's wealth, built on the systematic poisoning of human dignity, was now being destroyed by literal poison was not lost on her. By May of 1856, Jeremiah was confined to his bed, his once powerful voice reduced to whispered commands that often made little sense. The man who had ruled his domain with absolute authority now required assistance with the most basic tasks. Margaret, herself struggling with the effects of her own poisoning, was ill-equipped to manage both her husband's care and the plantation's operations. The bedroom that had once been Jeremiah's sanctuary became his prison. The walls were lined with ledgers and documents that he could no longer read, maps of properties he could no longer manage, and portraits of ancestors whose legacy he was destroying through his own incapacity. Celia would bring his meals to this room, watching as the man who had once terrified her struggled to feed himself. Thomas, as the eldest son, should have stepped seamlessly into his father's role, but the gold poisoning had affected his cognitive abilities in ways that made effective leadership impossible. His decision-making had become erratic, his temper unpredictable, and his judgment severely compromised. Business deals that should have been straightforward became disasters under his management. The transformation of Thomas was particularly striking because he had always prided himself on his intellectual superiority. He had attended the finest schools, read extensively, and considered himself a master of human psychology. Now he struggled to complete simple tasks and would often lose track of conversations mid-sentence. The plantation's financial situation began to deteriorate rapidly. Thomas made several costly mistakes, including selling crops at below-market prices and investing in ventures that any clear-thinking businessman would have recognized as fraudulent. The family's legendary wealth, accumulated over decades of exploitation, began to evaporate with alarming speed. One particularly disastrous decision involved a scheme to invest in a new cotton processing facility that existed only on paper. Thomas committed $50,000 to the project based on forged documents and testimonials from fictional references. When the fraud was discovered, the family lost not just their investment, but their reputation for business acumen. William, who had always managed the plantation's complex financial records with meticulous precision, found himself unable to perform even basic calculations. The gold poisoning had affected his memory and concentration to such a degree that he would start working on ledgers only to forget what he was doing minutes later. Important documents went missing, payments were overlooked, and the careful financial controls that had kept the operation profitable began to break down completely. The financial chaos that resulted from William's incapacity was staggering. Bills went unpaid, leading to penalties and interest charges that compounded the family's problems. Contracts were forgotten or mismanaged, resulting in legal disputes that drained resources and damaged relationships with business partners. The plantation's credit rating, once impeccable, began to suffer as word spread about their financial irregularities. Charles, the youngest son, had initially seemed the most resilient to Celia's campaign, but by summer, even he was showing clear signs of decline. His physical coordination had deteriorated, making him clumsy and accident-prone. More importantly, his judgment had become so impaired that he made several decisions that endangered the plantation's security, including relaxing supervision of the enslaved workers and failing to maintain proper discipline among the overseers. The breakdown of security on the plantation was perhaps the most visible sign of the family's declining control. Charles had always been responsible for maintaining the system of patrols and checkpoints that prevented escapes and maintained order. His deteriorating judgment led to gaps in coverage that the enslaved community quickly learned to exploit. The Morrison brothers, who had been key business partners and sources of financial support, were dealing with their own mounting problems. James Morrison's mysterious respiratory ailment had worsened to the point where he could barely speak above a whisper. His plantation's operations suffered as he became increasingly unable to provide clear direction to his overseers and managers. James's decline was particularly rapid and dramatic. The man who had once boasted about his ability to break the strongest spirits through sheer force of will now struggled to complete a sentence without coughing. His famous temper, which had once terrorized his workers, was now impotent rage trapped in a failing body. Robert Morrison, always the more cautious and calculating of the two brothers, found his analytical abilities severely compromised. The joint pain that had initially seemed like a minor annoyance had progressed to debilitating arthritis-like symptoms that left him in constant discomfort. More critically, his mental acuity had declined to the point where he could no longer effectively evaluate business opportunities or manage complex negotiations. Robert's transformation was perhaps the most intellectually tragic of all Celia's targets. He had been known throughout the region for his sharp mind and strategic thinking. Business partners would seek his advice on complex deals, and his analysis was considered the gold standard for investment decisions. Now, he struggled to follow simple conversations and would often agree to terms that were obviously disadvantageous. The network of plantation owners who had formed the core of the local aristocracy began to fragment as each family dealt with their own crises. Samuel and Benjamin Whitmore, Jeremiah's brothers, were experiencing similar health problems that made them unreliable business partners. The regular gatherings at Whitmore Manor, once the center of their social and business world, became increasingly infrequent as the hosts became unable to maintain their former standards of hospitality. Margaret Whitmore's decline was perhaps the most visible to the outside world. As the social leader of the local plantation society, her increasing erratic behavior became a source of gossip and speculation throughout the region. Her famous afternoon tea parties became exercises in chaos as she would forget guests' names, serve inappropriate refreshments, or launch into incomprehensible tirades about imagined conspiracies. The social implications of Margaret's decline extended far beyond the Whitmore family. As the unofficial leader of plantation society, her behavior set the tone for social interactions throughout the region. Her increasing unpredictability and paranoia began to affect the entire social structure that supported the plantation system. The psychological effects of the poisoning were as devastating as the physical symptoms. As their cognitive abilities declined, the family members became increasingly paranoid and suspicious of each other. Thomas accused William of deliberately sabotaging the plantation's finances. William blamed Charles for the security breaches that had allowed several successful escapes. Charles suspected Thomas of plotting to have him declared incompetent so he could seize control of the inheritance. This paranoia extended beyond the immediate family to their business relationships and social connections. They began to suspect their overseers of stealing, their business partners of cheating, and their social peers of plotting against them. The bonds of trust and mutual interest that had held their world together were dissolving as rapidly as their mental faculties. Jeremiah, in his lucid moments, ranted about enemies who were trying to destroy his family, never suspecting that the enemy was serving his meals and tending to his needs with apparent devotion. Margaret became convinced that the household staff were stealing from her, leading to increasingly harsh punishments for minor infractions, punishments that Celia endured while secretly celebrating each sign of the family's growing desperation. The plantation's operations began to reflect the chaos at the top. Overseers, taking advantage of their master's declining oversight, became increasingly brutal and arbitrary in their treatment of the enslaved workers. But they also became careless, and the breakdown in discipline worked both ways. Several successful escape attempts occurred during this period, as the normally tight security around the plantation deteriorated. The breakdown of the plantation's operational structure created opportunities that the enslaved community was quick to exploit. Work slowdowns became more common, as overseers struggled to maintain discipline without clear direction from above. Small acts of sabotage increased, as workers realized that the consequences for resistance were becoming less predictable and often less severe. Celia used this chaos to her advantage, carefully documenting everything while maintaining her facade of loyal service. Her hidden journal grew thicker with each passing month, recording not just the physical decline of her targets, but the broader collapse of the system they had built. Each entry was a small victory in her long campaign for justice. The local community began to take notice of the Whitmore family's troubles. Neighbors who had once envied their wealth and power now whispered about curses and divine retribution. Some suggested that the family was being punished for their excessive cruelty, while others speculated about business rivals or disgruntled former partners seeking revenge. The speculation and gossip that surrounded the family's decline became a form of social entertainment for their former peers. Tea parties and social gatherings throughout the region buzzed with theories about the cause of the Whitmore family's troubles. Some attributed it to divine justice, others to business rivalries, and a few to simple bad luck. Dr. Harrison, the family physician, became increasingly frustrated with his inability to diagnose or treat the mysterious ailments affecting the family. He consulted with colleagues in Atlanta and Savannah, but none could offer explanations for the constellation of symptoms he was observing. The idea that someone might be systematically poisoning the family never occurred to him. Such a crime was almost unthinkable in their social context. By autumn of 1856, the Whitmore plantation was in serious financial trouble. The combination of poor management decisions, failed investments, and declining productivity had created a crisis that threatened the family's survival. Creditors began demanding payment on outstanding loans, and several business partners withdrew from joint ventures, unwilling to be associated with the family's apparent incompetence. The enslaved community on the plantation watched these developments with a mixture of hope and fear. While they took some satisfaction in seeing their oppressors suffer, they also knew that desperate masters could become even more dangerous. Celia, moving among them as she went about her duties, became a source of quiet reassurance. Though she never spoke directly about her campaign, her calm confidence in the face of the family's growing chaos provided a sense that justice was finally being served. As winter approached, Celia reflected on the progress of her plan. 18 months of patient work had yielded results beyond her most optimistic expectations. The Whitmore Empire was crumbling, its leaders were broken, and the system of oppression they had built was beginning to collapse under its own weight. But her work was not yet complete. Several of her targets were still alive, though severely compromised. The final phase of her campaign would require even greater precision and patience, as she worked to complete the destruction of those who had caused so much suffering. The cook who had once been invisible was now the architect of their doom, and they still had no idea what was happening to them. The winter of 1857 brought with it a bitter cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of Whitmore Manor, but no chill could match the ice that had settled into Celia's heart as she prepared for the final phase of her 8-year campaign. The empire built on human suffering was on the verge of complete collapse, and she intended to ensure that none of its architects survived to rebuild. The manor itself had begun to reflect the decay of its inhabitants. Paint peeled from the once pristine columns, shutters hung askew from their hinges, and the gardens that had once been Margaret's pride were overgrown with weeds. The physical deterioration of the property mirrored the mental and physical decline of the family, creating an atmosphere of Gothic decay that would have been fitting for a ghost story. Inside the house, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. Servants moved through the halls with nervous efficiency, never knowing when one of the family members might explode into rage over some imagined slight. The once grand dining room, where so many cruel plans had been hatched over elegant meals, now echoed with the sound of confused arguments and paranoid accusations. Jeremiah Whitmore died on a grey February morning, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated effects of nearly 2 years of systematic poisoning. The official cause of death was listed as general decline and nervous exhaustion, but Celia knew the truth. The gold that had been his obsession in life had become his destroyer in death, the metallic particles having caused irreversible damage to his brain and vital organs. The death scene was both pathetic and fitting. The man who had once commanded absolute authority over hundreds of human lives died alone in his bed, his final words an incoherent rambling about lost gold and imaginary enemies. His body, once robust and intimidating, had wasted away to a skeletal frame that bore little resemblance to the powerful patriarch who had ruled the plantation with an iron fist. Celia was the one who discovered his body, entering his room with the morning coffee that would no longer be needed. She stood for a moment, looking down at the man who had caused so much suffering, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Justice had been served, but the cost in years of her own life and peace of mind was immeasurable. His funeral was a shadow of what such an event would have been just 2 years earlier. The grand gathering of plantation aristocracy that should have attended was notably sparse, as many of his former associates were dealing with their own mysterious health crises. Those who did attend whispered among themselves about the family's apparent curse, never suspecting that the woman serving refreshments at the wake was the architect of their destruction. The funeral service itself was a study in the decline of the family's social standing. The church that had once been packed for Whitmore family events was only half full, and many of the attendees seemed more interested in gossip than grief. The minister's eulogy was perfunctory, lacking the warmth and respect that would have characterized such a service in better times. Thomas, now the nominal head of the family, was in no condition to assume his father's role effectively. The gold poisoning had progressed to the point where he experienced frequent seizures and periods of complete disorientation. His attempts to manage the plantation's affairs resulted in increasingly catastrophic decisions that accelerated the family's financial ruin. The seizures were particularly devastating to witness, even for Celia. The man who had once prided himself on his intellectual superiority would suddenly collapse, his body convulsing uncontrollably while foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. The episodes left him confused and disoriented for hours afterward, unable to remember basic facts about his own life. Margaret, devastated by her husband's death and struggling with her own declining mental state, became a recluse. She spent her days in her room, emerging only for meals that Celia continued to prepare with her special ingredients. The woman who had once terrorized the household staff with her arbitrary cruelty was now a broken shell, mumbling incoherently about conspiracies and betrayals. The transformation of Margaret was perhaps the most complete of all Celia's targets. The social butterfly who had once commanded the respect and fear of plantation society was now afraid to leave her own room. She would spend hours staring out her window, convinced that she was being watched by enemies who existed only in her poisoned mind. William's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer perform even basic mathematical calculations. The plantation's financial records, once meticulously maintained, became a chaotic mess of incomplete entries and obvious errors. Creditors, recognizing the family's inability to manage their affairs, began demanding immediate payment on outstanding debts. The financial chaos that resulted from William's incapacity was staggering in its scope. Account books that had once been models of precision now contained pages of illegible scrawl and mathematical errors that a child would have caught. Important documents were misfiled or lost entirely, and the careful system of financial controls that had protected the family's wealth for generations collapsed completely. Charles, the youngest son, had initially seemed like he might escape the worst effects of Celia's campaign. But by spring of 1857, even he was showing severe symptoms. His coordination had deteriorated so badly that he could barely walk without assistance, and his judgment had become so impaired that he posed a danger to himself and others. The physical deterioration of Charles was particularly striking because he had always been the most athletic of the brothers. The man who had once ridden horses with reckless abandon now struggled to navigate the stairs of his own home. His hands shook so badly that he could barely hold a fork, and his balance was so poor that he required assistance to avoid falling. The Morrison brothers, key figures in the local plantation network, were also nearing their end. James Morrison's respiratory problems had progressed to the point where he could barely breathe, let alone speak. His plantation had been sold to pay debts, and he spent his final days in a small cottage, attended by a single servant who had no idea that her master's condition was the result of carefully administered poison. James's final weeks were a study in the complete reversal of power dynamics. The man who had once boasted about his ability to make grown men weep with fear now struggled to whisper simple requests to his caregiver. His famous voice, which had once boomed commands across cotton fields, was reduced to a barely audible rasp that required listeners to lean close to understand. Robert Morrison lasted slightly longer, his more cautious nature having limited his exposure to Celia's preparations. But the accumulated effects of months of small doses finally overwhelmed his system. He died in his sleep in April 1857, his body found by servants who noted the peaceful expression on his face, an ironic contrast to the suffering he had inflicted on others during his lifetime. Robert's death was discovered when he failed to appear for his usual morning inspection of the plantation grounds. His personal valet, concerned by the unusual delay, entered his master's bedroom to find him lying peacefully in bed, his face relaxed in a way that it had not been for months. The gold poisoning had finally claimed him during the night, his heart simply stopping as the accumulated toxins overwhelmed his system. Samuel and Benjamin Whitmore, Jeremiah's brothers, followed similar paths to destruction. Samuel succumbed in May, his body racked by the neurological symptoms that had become the hallmark of Celia's method. Benjamin lasted until June, but his final weeks were marked by such severe mental deterioration that he required constant supervision. Samuel's death was particularly dramatic, occurring during what should have been a routine business meeting. He had traveled to Savannah to negotiate the sale of some property, hoping to raise funds to cover his mounting debts. During the meeting, he suffered a massive seizure that left him unconscious for several hours. When he finally awoke, he was unable to recognize his own lawyer or remember why he had come to the city. As each target fell, Celia felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. These men had destroyed countless lives, separated families, and built their wealth on human misery. Their deaths were justice long overdue. But she also mourned for the years of her own life that had been consumed by this campaign, the innocence she had lost, and the terrible knowledge she now carried. The emotional toll of her campaign was something that Celia had not fully anticipated when she began her mission. Each death brought a sense of completion, but also a growing emptiness that she struggled to understand. She had devoted 8 years of her life to this single purpose, and now that it was nearing completion, she found herself wondering what would come next. The plantation community watched these developments with a mixture of awe and fear. The rapid succession of deaths among the ruling class was unprecedented, and many began to whisper about divine retribution or supernatural intervention. Celia, moving among them as she continued her duties, became a figure of quiet authority. Though she never spoke directly about her role in the family's destruction, her calm confidence in the face of chaos provided reassurance to those who had suffered under their oppression. By summer of 1857, the Whitmore plantation was in complete collapse. The family's debts had mounted to the point where creditors were preparing to seize the property. The enslaved community faced an uncertain future, knowing that they would likely be sold to pay the family's obligations. But there was also hope. The system that had oppressed